Good evening, everyone. Buona tarda, buenas tardes. My name is Nicoletta Piereddu. I'm the director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative, and I'm stepping in for Professor Thomas Banchoff, who is the convener of the Georgetown Global Dialogues, who cannot be with us tonight, but who is following us virtually. Our deep gratitude goes precisely to him, first of all, for his far-reaching vision and foundational work that for over 2 years have made our international conversations possible. And of course, to Pankaj Mishra, who in partnership with Professor Banchoff has so pivotally redefined the map of our global modernities, challenging us to look at the world through the eyes of the global majority. Barcelona has played and continues to play an essential role for us. The Centro de Cultura Contemporanea stands as a premier hub for global critical thinking and civic imagination, making it an ideal home for our humanistic inquiry. Judith and Carme, we owe you so much, and we owe a lot to the whole team. And muchas gracias as well to Libreria Finestres for your passionate commitment to the book as a vital breathing space for the encounter between ideas and the city. The Georgetown campus in Qatar was supposed to be our location for these global dialogues, but the devastating reach of conflict forced us to relocate and precluded Dean Safwan Masri from attending. Our days together will also invite us to reflect on how dialogue is often the first casualty of war and therefore our imperative priority. Our warmest thanks to all our Georgetown University DC campus partners, starting from the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and the Office of the Vice President for Global Engagement, in particular to the amazing trio, Lily Meyer, Amy van der Vliet, and Mary Gordon, for their seamless dedication and for being the vital pulse that keeps our logistics in motion. Needless to say, our inspiring fellows are the animating spirit of our multi-year conversations, and it's wonderful to have a chance to re-engage with you to deepen an inquiry that has grown more urgent with every mile of our journey. And it is an honor to welcome also new distinguished guests who have joined us more recently to expand the horizons of our culture of encounter. The conversation that inaugurates our global dialogues tonight is a poignant example of the transformative interaction we aspire to promote and sets the tone for the topic that will guide our gatherings, Futures for Hope in a Broken World. I'm delighted to give the floor to our panelists. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicoletta. Georgetown Global Dialogues, 3 years ago, actually around this time, exactly 3 years ago, and this grew out of conversations with the then president of Georgetown University. And I think at that point we shared the view that so many of our institutions, whether the media or even universities, are somehow failing to respond to what was then already apparent was a global crisis in the making in 2023, well before the war on Gaza erupted, well before many of the horrendous things that have happened since then. So I think the idea behind it was to create perhaps a different kind of community than the one created by academic conferences or literary festivals or writers coming together to sell their books, to take up questions which are not taken up at these places, to maybe revise our vocabulary, think about realms, areas, histories, traditions that we haven't really brought into conversation adequately, whether these are experiences and perspectives of countries from the so-called global south, or indeed suppressed, ignored, neglected traditions within Europe and America. So I think since then we've had these discussions, dialogues, debates, conversations in several locations. And it's only, I think, in the last few weeks, you'd probably agree with me, Nasreen, that the notion of a truly broken world has begun to resonate in a really sinister way. And I think today, thinking about this broken world, inhabiting it in various ways, we are in a way almost compelled to conceive of very rapidly a future where this world will no longer be as broken as it is today. A very minimal demand from the future. But I'm going to turn to Nasreen now and ask her to elaborate her vision of what this future could be or should be.
Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's such a full house. I'm so happy to be here in Barcelona again. It's a very special place and has a very different political climate to the one that we usually exist in other parts of Europe. So I'm very grateful to be here. I'd like to thank the conveners. I'd like to thank our hosts. I'd like to thank Tom Banshov, who is not with us today, but not only with us in spirit, but I believe on live stream. So if you're watching, hi Tom, we miss you. I've written down a few words when I was asked to think about how we conceive of hope or the future at a time when it seems that accumulating, overlapping events across the world is making it very hard to conceive of a future. So I'm going to talk about Sudan, where I'm from, which is, in terms of that broken world, the most broken place on earth now. And it seems to be like the most hopeless place, but that's not the whole story. So I want to talk a little bit about Sudan and a little bit about how we think about the present and history and how we forget that there are many things that are bearing down on us, but in moments of crisis, we forget that they're there. Anyway, I'll stop introducing my speech and actually make it. I want to start today with a couple of different moments. First, to Sudan, which is now entering its third year of war. Calling it a war does not quite do justice to the catastrophe that is unfolding. I'm aware that we're all exhausted after almost 3 years of genocide and conflict in Gaza and the Middle East, and since the expansion of the conflict into Lebanon, Iran, Syria, and the Gulf. But what is happening in Sudan is particularly grinding and cruel in its own way. Since April of 2023, the Sudanese have had to contend with not just a precipitous and sudden end to their lives as they knew them, but with a bewildering, unrelenting, almost flamboyant cruelty on the part of paramilitary forces. There is a kind of relish to the crimes that are being perpetrated in Sudan. In the gratuitous sexual violence and nonsensical killings of civilians, there is nothing strategic about it. There are no military objectives that are met. The forces do it because they can. And one feels like they're almost surprised that they can, celebrating in the revelation that no one is coming to help or to intervene. If you took a snapshot of Sudan today, what you will capture is the worst of humanity in all its capacity for hatred and mercilessness. The second moment I want to speak to, one that in fact led us here, is from only 7 years ago. Tens of thousands of Sudanese had gathered outside the army headquarters in Khartoum to demand the end of a 30-year military dictatorship, and they stayed. They stayed not for days or for weeks, but for months. It came to be known as the sit-in, the site of Sudan's revolution. The Sudanese were robbed of a chance to historicize and document what took place in those streets in those days. So quickly did war then engulf the country. But it was a miraculous event. People came in shifts, slept on the hard pavements, sat in the blistering heat, returning home only to wash and check in with their parents. Somehow, everyone was fed as trays and snacks and water appeared out of nowhere. The revolution site became a mini polity with breakout areas for speeches, poetry readings, and formal history lessons. Art was drawn on the walls, and old Sudanese songs were spontaneously sung in the crowd. The 3-decade-long dictatorship that they were opposing had not only oppressed the Sudanese people, it had effaced the country's culture, its music, its humor, and its literature, imposing a uniform state-dictated military and religious character on the country. Sudan itself paused with the military coup in 1989, and suddenly, here it was, alive among people that were not even born when the army had come to power. The revolution was a collective event of resurrection of a country that had been killed by the despots. There was no indication, no sign that these despots had not succeeded in doing so. The regime was at its strongest at the start of the revolution. There was no opposition to speak of. The government had complete domination over popular culture and the public space. It was at its most brutal and arrogant. The dictatorship, when it was in its darkest days, regularly killing street protesters and disappearing activists. But all that could not withstand the simple act of collective memory. Or indeed the grassroots WhatsApp committee set up literally neighborhood by neighborhood. After 4 months of this, Omar al-Bashir, the dictator, was gone. I talk of these two contrasting snapshots of Sudanese history because we tend to think of crises and wars as somehow defining. The unraveling of Sudan can be seen as the inevitable fate of a riven, tragic, primitive place. The Arabs are not ready for democracy was a regularly cited trope after the failures of the Arab Spring. But hope and change are not single events, but continuous processes. Sudan can also be seen as a microcosm of the broken world that we spoke of at the introduction of this talk, in which inconceivable suffering is tolerated or ignored. But it is also a microcosm, only in its recent history, of what remains indestructibly possible. There is more that joins the Sudanese people to others across the world than meets the eye. To be a person from a country at war, this is something that I have learned, to be a person from a country at war is to understand something that cannot be taught, only experienced. Our lives, wherever we are, all lie under a very thin veneer of stability. One only realizes how thin when it is so quickly and easily stripped away. More and more people are now reeling from this realization in hitherto stable places like Dubai and Riyadh and Doha. But also to greater or lesser extents, the realization is dawning among those who are insulated from the sharp end of war, but for whom the breaking of the world order and the calamities of the second Trump administration are beginning to encroach upon their own lives. To Americans, the killings of people on the streets of Minnesota by ICE are as inconceivable and norm-shattering as the missiles landing on the banks of Khartoum's Nile. And in both, there is still that latent collective imagining of a nation that can be better than this. That capacity for neighborhoods to stand up to Goliaths, to what seemed like forever systems and regimes. We think of the world in terms of geopolitics, of orders and eras, of rising or waning superpowers. But what is missed is the people that live on these shifting tectonic plates, the swelling numbers of the precarious and the displaced. They are portrayed as inert, without agency or even history, without cultural traditions or philosophical ones that could galvanize them into themselves, reshaping the world that is being created for them. The Sudanese revolution, and indeed all revolutions across the Arab world, drew on their own subjective overlapping histories of imagination. The socialist movements of the 1970s and 80s, the religious notion of the Ummah, the motherland joined together by Islam, the pan-Arab record of secular solidarity in language and in geography, and the anti-imperialism of the Suez era, and even in the remnants of the Palestinian cause, communists, Muslim Brotherhood members, and secularists all joined together. The present may seem final because we are living in it, but it is not. History shows us that. It is the reason that years after revolution, not a single dictator across the Middle East and North Africa sleeps easily. Why the prisons in Egypt still swell with detainees, and why pro-Palestine popular expression around the Arab world, its natural home, one would think, is banned or policed. There is too much that is still lurking and which could still explode. I talk about hope in these histories, not in the dream that they will be relived or expanded or succeeded or repeated and succeed again, but in the fact that all that has ever happened has always existed at one with despair. For those people in the streets of Khartoum in 2019, success was an improbability. I can tell you that. None of us thought it would work. But it ended up being an inevitability, the result of relentless effort on the part of those who expected nothing of the future, but could not tolerate the present. And so when we speak of hope, what we are really speaking about is how to persevere without it. I recall the words of an elderly uncle imprisoned and tortured again and again under the Sudanese dictatorship's regime. When I asked him about the point of continuing to tilt against an all-powerful government, he said, "When I die," which he did, "I want to do so in peace, in the knowledge that I did not give up my children's country." I'm going to refer to a quote here from a slightly unlikely source, so bear with me. In 2018, Rick Davis, the head of NASA's Mars study group, reflected on what he had learned in the 50-year duration of the project. The Mars study group project lasted 50 years, from beginning to success. His conclusion was that life is a generational relay race, he said. His own team worked for years on a mission that likely wouldn't launch until after they had retired, or more likely had passed away. Space exploration, he said in his experience, was not just a technical goal, but a fundamental biological drive to ensure the continuity and expansion of life. He said what he had learned in his 50 years of exploring the darkness of space is that, and I quote, "What all species do is create the conditions for life for those who come after us." It is a thread that one can find across the ages, from NASA in 2018 to my uncle's 1990s Khartoum, and also in Iraq 1200 years ago, in the writings of philosopher Abu Yusuf al-Kindi. He wrote, "We do not find the truth we are seeking without finding a cause. The cause of the existence and continuance of everything is the true one, the true cause, in that each thing which has being has truth." All that seems all-powerful has to contend with this primary impulse to create the conditions for life, to not abandon the future, to invest in the continuance. And it has to contend with the belief that always resides in people, no matter what barbarity they face, that the world belongs to them. And staking that claim through all sorts of artistic and political expression is a visceral human need. I want to end here on what might seem like a bit of a depressing note, but I find it quite heartening, by the Sudanese writer Tayyib Saleh, which encapsulates how hope resides in action without hope. He wrote, "At any point in life, he decides, now I am making a decision. I choose life. I shall live because there are a few people I want to stay with for the longest possible time, and because I have duties to discharge. It is not my concern. It is not my concern whether or not life has meaning." Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Nicoletta. I don't know where you are. And thank you all the people from CCB and also for Finestres for having us. I think it's also like a challenge and a pleasure to talk with Pankaj and Nesreen again. And it's so moving, your text. So I have some notes in order to follow the train of thoughts of Nesreen. I'm coming from Argentina, so I can switch to Spanish in any moment. So it's really, we are also speaking English here. And I can do some bilingual comments also if it is needed. So I would like to start with this idea of microcosm that you shared about our spaces, our countries, microcosm of that broken world, but also how we can think in our territories as spaces of resistance at the same time. And of course, is no possible comparison between Sudan and Argentina, but I am interested in following this idea of what kind of mechanism, of devices through which suffering is normalized in our regions. And also in terms of hope, which are other images that help us to make hope for our future. I want to share, I think, a main question: how we can defend practices that enable us to continue insisting on living a non-fascist life. ¿Cómo podemos defender las prácticas que nos permiten seguir insistiendo en vivir vidas no fascistas? At least, I think this is, for us in Argentina, a continuous question in these days, where the ultra-right wing is governing, but also developing politics of cruelty every day. So I think that some kind of hope we can, I think, sustain in terms of self-defense practice, but also how we can defend the practice that are there in order to insist in this non-fascist life. Maybe you saw in the newspapers, I saw that here in Barcelona was also a demonstration, but in Argentina, last Tuesday, we organized a lot of different collectives, organizations, popular movements, and of course, in particular, human rights organizations organize a very huge march remembering the 15th anniversary of the beginning of the dictatorship in Argentina. And it was really huge, really massive, and also, I think, a concrete source of hope, because it was a very transgenerational demonstration. It was also a way to organize different spaces of memory in football clubs, schools, former detention camps, community centers. So previous to the march, it was a really huge movement organizing these concrete spaces of memories, of political memories. And I think that this previous activity were crucial in order to become massive the moment of the demonstration. It was like a capillary organization that then appeared massively in the street. And I think that it was also powerful because it was a demonstration about how the past is not just nostalgia, but rather a powerful source of critique of the present. At least in Argentina, it was like that. We were talking about the dictatorship, and we were talking about how the dictatorship is continued by our government now. And we, different feminist collectives, were organized during the demonstration with two slogans. The first one, it was a recuperation of a banner from Madres de Plaza de Mayo that says financial power is terrorist. El poder financiero es terrorista. It was a very powerful slogan from Madres de Plaza de Mayo when they denounced the connection between external debt and dictatorship. And now we are using the same slogan to denounce the connection between the external debt, the household debt, and all the financial authoritarianism that is organized in our country through impoverishment, but also through different forms of privatization of public resources. So I think it's interesting to connect this notion, for example, of debt as a concrete device and a source also of political memory and the links and the continuity that the dictatorship and the ultra-right wing now, they are trying to develop as a way to present our conjuncture. But also, I think that now when debt, household debt in particular, is a mandatory resource to confront precarity, to confront impoverishment, I think it's very useful to reclaim that important political slogan and to update that slogan in our present. So I think it is also an important way to think in this history of political slogans as a sort of collective or social text that we are updating and recreating in different moments. And the other slogan that we created for this march is memory is disobedience. In order to vindicate how the struggles for political memory are a transmission about how to disobey in present time. And I think that this is also another important element, how we can transmit through generations some gestures of disobedience. Cómo podemos transmitir y cómo se nos han transmitido gestos de desobediencia. Si pensamos la memoria como una memoria de la desobediencia. And I think that when I was listening Nesrine about this sit-in in Sudan, as I was thinking how the different political technologies that we create from below at the beginning seems very fragile, and at the end they are so powerful. And I was thinking in the political technology of Madres de Plaza de Mayo, because when they started to protest in the square in Plaza de Mayo, the police said, you can be here, you can be stood up here. So they started to walk in circles. And they invented that political technology of walking together in circle, what we call las rondas de las Madres de Plaza de Mayo. And it was like they were inventing a political space when the political and the public space was completely closed. And I think this is a powerful image for us, but also because what we have learned is from them, from madres and abuelas, is forging kinship with the street. So they are reclaiming that they are mothers and grandmothers, but they are, from the beginning, going beyond the idea of biological kinship. They are reclaiming the idea of producing political kinship, and particularly a way of affective connection with the history. So, you know, there are a lot of very moving statements from the Madres de Plaza de Mayo about how they were reborn after the disappearance of their son and daughters. But I think it's very much important how they transmit this gesture of disobedience, how they transmit this creation of political technology of being together in the more cruel moment in our history. So the other thing that I would like to say here is the kind of political agency of them. It's not an isolated hero. They are all the time doing things together, and they are all the time inviting other struggles to gather. And I think this is also a political lesson from them. And of course, different movements produce a legacy of disobedience, taking into account this experience. And I think it's very much important how nowadays grassrooted initiatives recuperate the importance of the revolutionary dream of the militants in the 70s. And also, at the same time, they are claiming in the present about present struggles. So it is not just about the 70s, it is how the 70s matters in order to update the struggles in the present. And at the same time, they are very radical, for example, claiming, and this is something important for us, that no democratic government has been able to open the archives of the dictatorship. And also that no democratic government has been able to change the financial law that the dictatorship produced. So we have these two elements, state archives and financial law. That is a sort of line of continuity during democratic governments. And all the radical movements, and in particularly Madres Abuelas, they are claiming all the time about those two elements. And I think that our struggle against debt and financial devices as way of governments are also connected with this idea of financial power that is at the beginning of the dictatorship, and it is now a way of ruling our lives. Just two elements to finish this first intervention. I was thinking also about the cruelty that you were saying. You were saying that there is no strategy in that form of cruelty. And I would like to ask you if cruelty is not itself a strategic aim. Because at least in Argentina, the development of cruelty by the government, it is really much connected with this spectacular repetition of violence with the objective to desensibilize, but also with the idea of produce cruelty as the only social bond possible in the midst of precarity, impoverishment. So I was wondering if we can think that this kind of strategy is being deployed in a new sense. And finally, I think that is question of transgenerational legacies of resistance are very important. I want to quote this notion of Chilean collective feminist. They talk about the memory of the future. We are producing now the memory of the future. And I think that this idea, las memorias del futuro que estamos produciendo hoy, it's very powerful because when future generations ask themselves what was happening during, for example, Milei's government or during war, I think that they will be talking about what we are doing now. So I think this is our responsibility, how we are building now the memory of the future.
Thank you. Well, wonderfully apt reflections here on an evening which has just witnessed one of the biggest demonstrations in London in recent years, mass mobilization against the far right of the kind we haven't seen, I mean, certainly not in my lifetime. And for many people, as reminded, I've been receiving photographs from my 18-year-old daughter who's there in the demonstrations of various, demographics, populations, genders that are represented there, and the sheer sort of diversity, energy, vitality of it. And she's become really fascinated by the big anti-racist mobilizations of the 1970s. So there's a certain kind of historical memory that she's now accessing through certain cultural expressions. When she sent me this, I was reminded of, in India, the largest mass protests, which happened 5 years ago, Ranjit, when again some very interesting memories were invoked. A memory of resistance in Pakistan. So a particular line became hugely resonant across India, Hum Dekhenge, which was actually a line that was sung famously in a stadium in Pakistan against the military dictatorship there. And that became a rallying cry for many people in India. So again, in a very interesting instance of how a certain kind of memory of resistance becomes potent in a completely, at some level, even in the country of the antagonist, or the geopolitical antagonist. More recently, Pedro Sanchez reactivating No a la guerra, suddenly becoming, kind of, in a way, reminding people of the kind of resistance the Spanish people put up to the Iraq War, mobilizing on that basis. That's still not drawing upon culture. But what I wanted to ask was, what role do you think does culture play in this? Because you mentioned that when you spoke, Nasreen.
Yeah, I think it's huge, and I think this is something I only recently I've begun to realize is how important culture is. I think we tend to separate culture from politics, or think of culture as more entertainment or diversion. But I was surprised by the Sudanese revolution, and actually the Arab Springs in general, but particularly the Sudanese revolution because I was so close to it. But also since how much, particularly since the conflict began in the Middle East, how much between Arabs culture suddenly has become really quite shimmery, things that had a sort of neutral resonance, songs, poems, literature, even old soap operas, right? Even old like cheesy series that we used to watch in Ramadan in the 1970s, 1980s, suddenly took on this very potent quality because they became ways through which we translated our sense of being, like we are here, we have our senses are here, we are listening and we are seeing and we are experiencing, but also it became a way for us to find each other because these were our shared references. And if you exist in regions or countries that have long records of dictatorship, what that does to culture is it sort of makes culture subservient to power, right? So culture becomes something monothematic. It becomes something dry. It becomes something that is state-oriented. And so taking refuge in what existed before or since, but in hiding, becomes a political act, right? And so I've been very surprised by how much culture organically and spontaneously turns up in moments of political crisis, but also how much individually, I speak personally in this regard, how much individually so many people from Arab-speaking countries have begun to seek old scraps of culture. YouTube videos from the 1970s, 1980s, speeches by Arab presidents. There is this sense of, and I alluded to this in my talk, is that this was not all there was. Something existed before this, and therefore it can exist again. I'll pause there so I can give Veronica a chance to speak.
I think that culture is like source of popular self-esteem, because at least in Argentina, that all the public schools, public universities, but also community centers are being targeted by the government. I think that they try to destroy the sources of popular collective self-esteem. And all the time, in Argentina, the discussion is how we, with our tradition of struggles, of political commitment, now we have this awful and terrible government. And I think that all the time culture appear as a way to revisit our past, but also to recreate what we can do now and how we can become another thing that is not what we are living now. So all the time, the government in Argentina is trying to manipulate the traditions of political cultures of resistance, for instance, trying to devaluate this kind of popular culture. And when I was talking about the different activities that were developed before the march, but also the different activities that we organized before the March 8 demonstration, the feminist demonstration, I think that all those capillarized activities and initiatives are part of a way to activate this popular culture of resistance, very much connected with different memories and legacies, but also I think with the idea that we have to rethink what we have been doing in order to resist in a new way with new strategies our present. Because, of course, in Argentina, the political victory of the ultra-right wing is something that we are discussing all the time, and how it was possible, and how now we have to confront with different tools. So I think that the issue of culture as a source of self-esteem is crucial, because I think that the government is all the time betting to devaluate our collective energy.
May I ask you, what really happened to cause this rupture in historical memory? I mean, I know it's a very broad question, but why is it that you had these protests, mobilizations? How was this memory squandered? How was this sort of this very incredibly important legacy neglected for so long? What really happened in the interim?
That's a very big but also very crucial question. So I'll answer the first part of it is how does collective memory become ruptured? And two things broadly happen to interrupt that process of collective memory and culture and history and what brings people together to stop binding them. The first is violence. Purely. The first is fear, violence, and killing. So that's what happened in the first stage, is that this sit-in that produced this completely unexpected result was then violently dispersed. Thousands of people were killed and their bodies were thrown into the river. And it is a trauma that still haunts the country, because there was no need for it to be that violent, but there was the way in which the sit-in was finally disbanded, even after the president had resigned, is because the military wanted to say, this is far enough. You've got what you wanted, but you can't go further into the military economic security system that has existed for years and years, and the people wanted to change that as well. So the first is violence. The second thing is capture. this is something that is, I speak again about Sudan in the Arab world, but one of the most profound problems in the Middle East, North Africa, is the total capture of the means of cultural production. The very sophisticated way in which politicians have over years and years managed the public space, could taken control of television and broadcasting, censored even what is digital and what is online, very sophisticated systems of censorship, and also created a sense that public expression, whatever it is always political, right? This sense that even if you are a teenage girl doing a TikTok dance in the street and taking a video of it, that is somehow something that can be portrayed as an insult to the character of the nation. So the sense that all cultural production is potentially political, which means that people begin to think and create in very safe and tame ways. So this is the kind of the third point, which is once you do capture culture and make it state-oriented and political, you then make sure that artists and thinkers and writers spontaneously flinch because there's these guardrails because they want to survive. I was speaking to a senior YouTube employee. So there's Arabic YouTube, which is huge, billions and billions of views every year. It's much bigger than it is in the English-speaking world because there is such a paucity of state broadcasting. And I asked her, how come there have been no big Arab-speaking pop stars that have talked about Palestine or indeed what's happening in the Gulf? Because usually after 2-3 years of war, there's music, there's art, there's culture, and there's nothing, particularly in music. And she said, because they know that it is a matter of annihilation if they speak. They know that if they produce a song, even something quite simple, like a little ditty or a chorus touching upon politics or Palestine or Iran or Israel, then things will just move around them and disappear them in ways that they know very clearly. And so the third part is that sense of like an electric shock around your neck. But when governments overreact, right, happens a lot in the Middle East, North Africa, there's these massive overreactions to people posting on social media, in particular. Tweets, people are arrested for tweets, for TikTok dances. And whenever people express distress in the situation, I'd say to them, I think this is really encouraging because it just shows how terrified they are, right? It shows how much is still so volatile, how much they understand that beneath these little expressions are like huge, profound frustrations and energy. So they must police every little thing all the time. I'll stop there, but I could talk about this for hours. I'll let you speak.
No, I was thinking also in the continuity, even though all this violence and media attempts to close the culture and the resistance traditions are being deployed in Argentina. Just to go back to the experience of Madres de Plaza de Mayo, because we are so moved by this experience. Since 1977, each Thursday, they are in the square. Each Thursday. So they never abandon this walking together each week since 1977. So I think it's something really amazing how they sustain. Now they are 95 or 97. So they are saying we have to transmit. We have a legacy. For example, when from the feminist movement, we organize different activities, initiatives, and also marches. We are all the time asking how they were able to sustain for so long this collective device of being together, thinking together, and hosting other struggles. Because, in every moment that you can go next Thursday and to meet them. They will be there. So you have like un faro, you have like a place where to go, and we can narrate the recent history in Argentina as how this walking together around the square is a sort of hosting place for so many different struggles. And you can like build a sort of genealogy of different struggles, saying how they were hosted by this way of being together and how they invented, I insist with that, this political technology with nothing, just being together.
Can I just add to that? I was in the Dome of the Rock mosque in Jerusalem last year, and there's a Muslim entrance and there's an entrance for non-Muslims, but in the actual mosques, only Muslims can enter. It was my first time, and I went in, and there was a group of women who were sat outside the mosque, and then another group of women who were sat inside the mosque. And I came in and I asked them where one can, do the ablution so you can pray, and they led me around. Extremely friendly women, mostly elderly, all dressed the same. And I asked a companion of mine, are these people who just come to pray? And she said, no, these are a group of women that basically have a sit-in in the mosque and have done for decades. And they hand over to their daughters because there's a female section in the mosque, and they have a name. They're called al-murabitun, which roughly translates as the patrollers or the standers. So people kind of stand guard or who patrol, and they're only women, no men, are performing that role. And they have kept it going for years and years. And they're sort of almost the spiritual guards of the mosque against the final act of the mosque being taken away and occupied in East Jerusalem. And there's something about that act of, to go back to my remarks at the beginning, it is the most futile act, right, on the face of it. The entire perimeter of the mosque area is guarded by IDF soldiers. They have final say in who comes in and who goes out. They regularly close it down. It is an occupied quarter of the city, as is so much of the West Bank. This act of coming and sitting and praying and sleeping in the mosque for years and years, the most futile act, has no impact whatsoever on what's happening in East Jerusalem or the West Bank or in Palestine in general. But there is something in it that is that point or that moment of investment in the future, right? That moment or that insistence that this, if this is all that you can do, this is all that remains, this is a seed, right? This is something that can go somewhere, because the act of claiming is more important than the result of claiming, if that makes sense, right? All you can do is claim. What happens after that is out of your control. And I think that comes back to a question many of us have been asking ourselves over the past few years. I don't want to speak on behalf of the audience, but certainly my experience. And young people, particularly that I speak to, students say, nothing works. Protest doesn't work. Elections don't work. We're getting the wrong leaders. We are not managing to change people's minds. Things are getting worse and worse and worse, and we feel like it's hopeless. And I find that way of thinking of hope as the key to success, right? Or as action as the key to success, like you're going to put a card in an ATM and you're going to get the right political result, is in itself dispiriting, because that's A, not how things work, B, not how they've ever worked, but C, your responsibility is to act. It's to put the energy into the world. It's to sit inside the mosque when you're surrounded by IDF soldiers for years and years, and they still haven't taken it. It is to come back to the square. It is to write, it is to speak, it is to protest, it is to do all these things. And the hope is to coexist with the sense that you are not sure if this is going to work. But what is definitely not going to work is if you do nothing.
Actually, it reminds me of some very revealing, very interesting sentences in Hannah Arendt, where he talks about how if you think of solidarity as simply the means to an end, you might be in some trouble. Better to think of solidarity as a way of life, as a way of being with other people, rather than thinking of it in this sort of instrumental way, because, that's how an ideal political existence, or all existence is political in one sense, is essentially the intense consciousness of other people, their needs, and the desire that we all share to work together. And that, sorry, I interrupted you.
No. I think that this element of insistence, persistence as a political act, as you were saying, I think that you were saying that, produces other idea of even of political efficacy. So we are not saying that we are not looking for something, but it's another way of think about political efficacy, and how the perseverance of this way of being together is also a way to make room for another images of resistance. I think that imagination is not just a plan of your mind and then you put it in act, ¿no? Que la imaginación no es como un plan mental que después organiza la acción, más bien que es la acción la que habilita y permite que emerjan imágenes nuevas a partir de la práctica misma, ¿no? That is another way to think in imagination, not just as a abstract performance, rather how different practices make room for new imagination.
May I add one thing, Funke? I don't know how we're doing for time. I feel like there's also an element of impatience, an element of short durations and attention spans that is just a feature of our age. I feel like there is a cyclical, short-term nature to how we consume political events and the news, and we are burned up by it really quickly and then burnt out by it really quickly, and things don't work, and therefore you try and move on to something else. I just urge us to think a little bit more when it comes to how we stretch out and attenuate our hope and our sense of the future, is also how much is the way we are consuming and bombard information and being bombarded with information, how is that affecting our ability to think calmly and peacefully and reflectively on the world and our role in it? Sometimes I feel like I have turned into a fist and I can't think, and I've realized that that's just because I have absorbed so much anger, so many images, so much that feels desperate and futile. And we were not meant to see all the world at the same time, right? We were not meant to see every single child who is in pain and everywhere. We are not meant to hear the inner thoughts of a fool in the White House all the time. Like, we are not meant to be consuming or have access to all this information, and it kind of fries our circuits a little bit on our ability to think calmly. And so I feel like the question of hope and the future and how we can all kind of expand ourselves a little, not in terms of achieving political results, but just how to move through the world as thinking, feeling people who have hope for good political outcomes, there's also something we can do in terms of how we relate to and consume information, and understand that there's a kind of, there is a deliberately short cycle to everything now.
Can I just a line that we are living in Argentina, at least, but in a global scale, with this fascist acceleration all the time. So the political question is also about political temporality, against anxiety, against this kind of despair, and also connected with productivity as the only notion that makes sense. So when we were talking those past weeks about how to organize, all the time we were discussing that now, at least in Argentina, precarity, debt, and also different forms of violence and repression are against our capacity, but in particularly our temporality to organize and to have time to think together and to have time to go to an assembly and to have time to make a statement collectively with other times. So I think that this temporality against fascist acceleration is crucial also. Yes.
Questions from the audience?
It's for you. You mentioned this cruelty that there's no strategy to that cruelty. And I think we know very little about that. We know a lot in Argentina about that cruelty, but there was a strategy. It was meant for something. Is it in Sudan a cruelty with no strategy at all?
Broadly, yes, I think. Different cruelties have different origins, but in Sudan, it is the product of an explosion, right? An explosion of anger and an explosion of redistribution of power. Things happen very quickly in Sudan when they did happen. And you have a paramilitary force that is 100,000 strong, that have been outside of power for as long as Sudan has existed and marginalized. And to them, cruelty is an expression of power. That is the only point of it. It's an expression of power to them, not even to their victims. Does that make sense? And so there is this sense of, it's almost as if somebody has suddenly come into money and then they begin spending it really lavishly. That is the nature of the violence in Sudan at the moment. It is a spendthrifty violence. It is a violence that is the act of someone who has suddenly come into way more power than they ever thought they did as someone from a marginalized background. And so there is celebration and relish in it. Obviously, it is also corrosive to the people who are enacting it, but they're not thinking about that now. It's all too fresh. And that kind of cruelty is incredibly difficult to interrupt. Strategic cruelty, you can have counter strategies too, right? But this sort of cruelty, which happens actually very rarely, where you get moments where it's just this kind of explosion, that sort of cruelty needs much more active, forceful intervention, and that's just not going to happen.
Do you think this is also, it's not just in Sudan that these people are also feeding upon a global culture in which, first of all, the acquisition of power is a much esteemed value, is a cherished value, in fact. And then that power is only satisfying once it's synonymous with domination. And those two things are actually, in a way, dominant, in several global cultures. I see this in India. You certainly see this in the Trump White House and the Trump State Department, the way they talk about how we've killed that many people, how more killings are going to happen, how we love it,
How it's more fun
how it's more fun to kill. So there is I think this sort of building upon this valorization, this worship of power, and then again equating it with power is only really power when it can be turned into domination. That seems to be something that's happening globally.
There's someone take
I was very impressed by a text published by Equator, by yes, this is propaganda, by Melinda Cooper. She talks about Epstein family values, and she talks about the idea of a political economy of sexual property, and how fascism today is so connected with this regime of sexual property. And at least in Argentina, we see very clear how the power of Milei is very much connected with this exposition of sexual violence, and how he tries to connect with sexual violence in everyday life as a sort of common language with his voters. So I think it's another level of cruelty that is also very much connected with this global level, but also very much embedded in different places. At least in Argentina, is very clear how Milei is responding and attacking and targeting the feminist and trans-feminist movement, and how he's organizing this vocabulary of sexual violence as a way of domination, as you were saying, connected with this power, but with this machine of cruelty.
Isn't that a desire for white supremacy values?
Completely. Yeah. Very much connected.
Yeah. Being in power again with the white supremacy values.
Completely. Yeah.
This has always been like that.
Exactly.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for this. I just walked into the bookshop and I didn't know this was happening, so it's been a really nice surprise. So the three of you touched on so many things that I'm gonna have to be reflecting the rest of the weekend. But sorry, I have to look up your name because I just got here. Nesreen?
Yes.
Yes. You talked about the capturing the means of cultural production, which I think is an incredible way of seeing what is really happening. And that made me think about, you discuss how, by politicizing everything, you're able to censor everything and how that works in favor of the regime. And then, Veronica, then you discussed how violence ends up being like the connector of people, like how people are connecting to each other through violence because that's what they're seeing. And then to you, you discussed Pankaj, sorry, how power is only power when it shows dominance. And so in relation to all of those three things, do you think that what we are doing as a culture, especially with like this concept of cancel culture, which I'm not really have a lot of thoughts on that, but like, do you think the way that we react to each other in such punitive public ways of punishing each other for that is also a way of like, are we perpetuating that same idea of like, but just in of policing what everyone says and the way that everyone acts, so people are scared to say things or say the wrong thing even if they have the same values, maybe because like, one, we think that everything is political, which it is in many ways, but then we're reacting to each other in a violent way because that is our only source of power, because that we don't have power in our everyday lives, especially for marginalized communities. So that is our only source. Do you think there's any relation to that?
May I begin? Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. And yes, I agree, actually. I think in the analyses of cancel culture and like the big wokeness moment that everyone has agreed now has gone wrong. I'm like, when did we agree? But we've all like the judgment is that the big movements of Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all these sort of post 2020 movements went too far, and produced cancel culture and wokeness, and now we have to kind of come to our senses again. That's for another day. But I do think there are excesses. Yes, I do think people over police. And I do think that there now exists, mostly in the digital era, a tendency to create like this perfect politics that no one will ever achieve. There's a couple of reasons I think that exists. Number one, it's social media. Social media just creates a gladiatorial environment that gives people too much power over other people, and it just becomes really hard not to use it. So I think part of it is just the kind of psychology that social media creates. But the second thing is I agree. It is because we do not have power, right? I think the left has not been in power meaningfully or in the practice of power for so long that there is a sense of relish and a sense of potency in your ability to cancel someone, right? In your ability to say, this is not the correct move. This is not the right way. So I'm quite indulgent of it, because I think, if you as a left-wing movement disempower your activists and you don't create a broad church, and you don't think forgivingly and indulgently upon your people, then you are going to create these schisms. And there has been this schism that there's like a serious left and a kind of silly left, right? And I think the serious left has a responsibility towards the silly left. I'll stop there.
Just a comment, and thanks for connecting the different arguments. I think that they try to convince us that the only way to democratize power is through punitive elements. So this is the only way that they offer us a sort of democratic use of powers. So I think that is really incredible how after from different movements, we were denouncing violence and denouncing punitive states and denouncing different forms of, cultures of violence. Now the solution is this democratization of punitivism. And I think this is a real problem. And also, I completely agree with Nisreen about the media and the social platforms as companies that are very much invested in that purpose.
More questions? Oh, Gavin.
Thank you. Yeah, you have talked about a lot about cruelty, no, in this conference, and I will ask you if you could give your thoughts or opinions about the people who justified this cruelty, right? People who may support far-right political parties, who may support their ideas, right? In Argentina, in Sudan, it's a bit different, right? But in India, you have also all across the world, right? You have occasions where people in Gaza and the genocide, you have people who choose to not look at this cruelty and then justify it or just, right? Because I am from my experience, these people can be your friends, right? Can be your family, your neighbors. I mean, they are people just like you, right? But you see it in more countries, people who, when in very different events happen, they choose to justify them or just look away. Right?
Another excellent question. These are all excellent questions. So it's a few things. I'll touch on a couple, and maybe I'll leave Veronica and Pankaj to address the rest. I think this particular point about these people are your friends and your family is the thing that has been quite bewildering to people for at least 10 years, I think, because you had like Brexit in the UK splitting families apart, the Trump election, and then since what's happened in Gaza. And I think I've thought about this a lot, and I have quite a simple formulation, which is that people are political actors, but they also just have different personalities, right? And I think sometimes we conceive of politics or values as landing on people, even though they have similar backgrounds, they won't have they will have also similar personalities. And I think some people, and again, this seems quite simple. I think some people find that comfort in believing that things aren't as bad as they are, right? Sometimes the people who advocate or who support the worst excesses of far-right governments or cruel governments are people that just cannot believe that things are as bad as they are. And so they want to believe the justifications, right? There is a kind of hectic self-soothing there by people saying, oh, but, there are too many immigrants, so maybe you do need to deport them. And yes, no, but Hamas attacked the Israelis first. And so sometimes there is a certain kind of person who would rather believe the world is better than it is than confront the truth. Then there's another kind of person who sees themselves in the body or in the person of the powerful, right? People who think that that what Trump embodies, for example, is an aspiration to them. They want to be able to get away with stuff. They want to be able to not have any kind of social conventions act upon them. There is a sense of vicarious freedom and license that powerful people give their supporters. That's why millions and millions of people vote for him, right? There is a sense that in his power, you can also have power. And then there are also the people that just do not or cannot enervate themselves or gather themselves, right? Or marshal themselves enough to confront the real cruelty and evil that lies behind what they're supporting. It's, this is why across history, if you read, writings and records of anything that has happened in world wars and holocausts, in genocides across the world, there are different categories of people that acted different ways, right? There's the cowards, there's the lazy people, there are the materialistic people. There's so many taxonomies of humanity that I think we forget, especially when there is a sharp political crisis upon us, because we're just like, it's so obvious, why aren't you like this? And I think stepping back a little bit and understanding that there are so many different permutations of how one is human that involves weakness, fragility, vulnerability, also evil and cruelty, then that makes it a little less bewildering, and it makes it kind of not your business, right? It's not your concern. You have to do what you can, but these are essentially the actions of people that must find their own way. I'll stop there.
Just add maybe that austerity policies convinced us that there is not enough for everyone. At least in Argentina, no alcanza para todo el mundo. This is part of a common sense. So, with this form of arguing, you are supporting the idea of some population have to be sacrificed. And I think that is something that is part of some kind of political subjectivity, that you are very realistic at the same time that you are saying, well, it is true that it's not enough for everyone. And at the same time that you want to be saved and be the other of those sacrificed populations. So I think that this mechanism is very close, because you could be the next to be sacrificed. So I think that this is also very much connected with how the material conditions in everyday life are being affected by austerity policies. and how it is not just economics, it is performing at the level of political subjectivity.
Absolutely. I think, the idea of cruelty as a social ethic is still something new. I'm old enough to remember a social ethic that was one of personal austerity. It was one of self-renunciation. It was not this idea that, there isn't enough for all of us. And some people are getting an unfair share or disproportionate share of the national resources. So definitely, yeah, there is that been a major shift in our sort of political cultures and our journalistic cultures too, I think, where this idea has become slowly entrenched, institutionalized.
Gavin.
Thank you, everyone. That was great. To what extent can kind of feminist political thought and action act as a kind of repository for more kind of general political thinking about how we expand our kind of political imagination, right? If authoritarian regimes are kind of they act by foreclosing political futures. And then I guess the second, I'd be interested to know in the kind of Argentinian context is to what extent does the kind of politics of care play as a kind of counter-hegemonic kind of politics against the politics of cruelty?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, they are very much connected, and thanks for the questions. And I think that effectively the idea of care, collective care, are at stake when they are targeting against feminist women collectives, but especially this capacity of feminist and women collectives and actions and initiatives to expand the idea of dignified life, for example, and how a politic of dignity, for example, is a politics for all and not just for sectors or groups or collectives. I think that this expanded notion of politics that the feminist and women and trans feminist collective are all the time proposing is what produces this kind of political threat that is very much well read by the government. So I think that in the way that the feminist and trans feminist movement are denouncing austerity in that sense, that we were talking as a social bond, not only as a sort of politics from above, but also the objective of reshaping the social bond. But also the way that those collectives are struggling for social reproduction in an expanded also way, not only for household, but in terms of communities, neighborhoods, and also migrant policies. They are expanding all the time beyond the idea of a sectorial element of politics. And I think this is very interesting when the feminist and transfeminist initiatives, when they are saying we are doing politics for everyone and we are interested in producing another way of political intervention. And we are talking about childcare, but also against household debt. And at the same time, we are denouncing racism of the state, but also at the same time, we are imagining new policies of housing, for example. I think that everything is part of trans feminist interest of politics. And this sort of expansive idea of politics is what is perceived by the ultra-right wing as a sort of important threat. Because if you have only sectors, you can negotiate with different sectors. And you can divide the political interest. And I think that when you have this kind of politics that you want everything and you want to produce alliance with very different groups, I think this is more complicated in terms of isolating negotiation. So I think this is a key to understand the radicality, the concrete radicality of those forms of politics.